Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. My name is Aisha, and I am the founder of Remake. I am joined here by some incredible women leaders in the fashion industry to discuss our OECD side session, due diligence in the garment and footwear sector. We are really going to hone in on brand accountability. As people are joining, welcome. I really hope to keep this session very interactive. And so as questions come up, please feel free to use the chat function, the Q&A box, to put in your questions. I was going to start with a little bit of context. 2021 has been a really exciting year for policy with the passage of California's Senate Bill 62, the Garment Worker Protection Act. One of the things that is really exciting about this bill is that it eliminates the piece rate system, which is a common vehicle through which sub-minimum wages become endemic in the fashion industry. The second really important piece of this act is that it holds brands and retailers jointly liable for wages stolen from garment workers. As I reflect on this bill is truly an example of extraordinary worker-led organizing, broad and deep coalition building, and remarkable solidarity from businesses and citizens alike. And this bill really closes a major regulatory gap in the United States' largest apparel producing hub, the state of California. SB 62 is by far the most important victory that we have in the global brand accountability movement because it secures legal responsibilities from companies for workers' most fundamental human right, fair pay. As I said, today's panel will be exploring joint liability for wage theft within the greater brand accountability movement. We have key coalition members from SB 62, as well as colleagues who will share more on the fight for joint liability from brands in Asia. We are really fortunate today to have the incredible Marissa, Executive Director of the Garment Workers Center. GWC was a co-sponsor of the Garment Worker Protection Act, what we fondly call SB 62 here in California. And Marissa is here to share how the pandemic really reshaped and sharpened the movement for corporate accountability, and we'll dig into the specific legal approaches for SB 62. On our panel, we also have my wonderful colleague, Elizabeth Klein. She's the Director of Policy and Advocacy for Remake. Remake, our organization, is a US-based nonprofit focused on empowering women for fair wages and eliminating injustices in the fashion industry. Elizabeth and I are here to provide a bit of a lens on the broad coalition that it took to assure the passage of SB 62. Finally, we have Nivedita, the Asia Coordinator on Labor Rights for the Asia Floor Wage Alliance, who we fondly call AFWA for short. This is an Asian labor-led alliance across garment-producing countries, addressing poverty-level wages, gender discrimination, and freedom of association. Nivedita will be here to provide a perspective on legal liability for wage theft across Asia and what that fight looks like. So we have so much to talk about. Why don't we start with you, Marissa? Marissa, I would love to get your lens on. It took 20 years of campaigning, and then, this 2 years of the most recent fight with workers really on the helm to get SB 62 passed. I would love to get your lens on, the legal approach for eliminating piece rate and assuring joint liability, and particularly getting your perspective on how did the pandemic impact the passage of SB 62?
Yeah, well, thank you. Thank you so much for having me. And hello, everybody who's joining us. Yes, that's right. I think the Garment Workers Center has always had a brand accountability approach and philosophy to our organizing, believing that the only ways that we're going to end the labor exploitation in this industry is if fashion brands are held accountable. 20 years ago, garment workers and advocates passed the first Garment Worker Protection Act, intending to hold fashion brands accountable. However, as happens sometimes in policy campaigns, there was just a little bit of watering down of language in that particular policy. And our state labor commission did not interpret it to hold fashion brands accountable. They interpreted it only to go up one step in what is often a very convoluted supply chain, as we know, in garment. And that left workers really without the ability to bring their claims against fashion brands, and often left them with wage claims that were only brought against their factory owner, or one contract up, and they were often left with the inability to recover their wages. And workers for 20 years tried to bring their cases forward, bring the smartest case, have all the evidence, just really work with advocates, and it just wasn't working. Aside from that, workers were also bringing public campaign after public campaign against fashion brands, trying to also use that strategy. Let's hold them accountable in the public sphere. Let's shame them. Let's expose them. Let's use the ethical, moral argument. And they found it harder and harder as 20 years passed. And so workers said, we've tried these strategies. We have to essentially raise the bar in the legal landscape. We have to change the landscape for us to be more successful in our organizing strategies. And that's what they decided to do. They decided to do a take two on the Garment Worker Protection Act and clarify that it was always intended to go up the chain to hold brands accountable. But what workers also said is, that is going to have a huge impact on a sort of big scale level. But every day when we walk into our factory, we're getting paid pennies at a time. We're getting paid a piece rate, 2 cents to set a sleeve, 3 cents to hem a skirt. And they said, if that doesn't change, we're still experiencing exploitation. And they said, we want to eliminate the piece rate. And I always laugh a little because as advocates, as activists fighting alongside workers, we thought it was a little crazy. How are we going to do both of these things? And they said, we're living this, and this is what we're telling you needs to happen. And we said, okay, we got to build the power to do that. We have to build the alliances. We have to build up your membership base, build the power to do it. And that's what we did. And then, so 2 years ago, we introduced this bill with those two key components. And in the middle of that, as you said, Aisha, a pandemic happened, a global pandemic. And certainly our first thought was, well, there goes our campaign. We're going to have to take a step back. Many of our members lost their jobs overnight. There was a lot of upheaval in the pandemic, but as we began to sort of get our feet under us, find our ways to provide mutual aid, within our membership, our members said, if the legislature, if our state is still going to operate, we want to continue our campaign. And they did it all over Zoom. But they decided to also use that moment of the pandemic and tell their story in that context. And because many garment workers in California became essential workers, they began to make masks. They began to sew, hospital gowns and other, protective apparel. And they said, if you're going to elevate us to this term, to the status of essential workers, you must also elevate our labor standards. And that became sort of a galvanizing message for them in their campaign.
Incredible, Marissa. Talk about taking a really difficult time, the pandemic, and then highlighting the types of issues that garment makers are up against, and using that as a moment to pass this wide sweeping bill. Right. So Elizabeth, we pass SB 62, and I wonder if you can now lend a lens to it becomes law come January 1st of this year. What does this mean from a joint liability perspective globally? What is your sense of the implications for the industry writ large?
Yeah, it's such a good question because, to Marissa's point, SB 62 was focused on addressing a specific ecosystem, manufacturing ecosystem in California in some ways. California has a lot of small garment shops. They were mostly using the piece rate system of pay to underpay garment workers. But there were a lot of aspects of what was going on in Los Angeles that are the same dynamics that we see globally in terms of the pressure on wages and working conditions originating with brands. And what was really useful with SB 62 is the Department of Labor, the US Department of Labor had, after 20 years of not being able to get to the bottom of this wage theft and not being able to stop it, they went in and started doing research on how brands were costing products. And what they found was that brands were only paying 73% of what was necessary for factories to meet the minimum wage. So the buck literally stopped with the brands. And that was really kind of a crucial piece of developing this emphasis on brand liability, because we had this wonderful data showing that the problem was really originating with brands. And if you look globally, there's a lot of research that shows that this negative pressure on wages, the fact that we have seen wage stagnation in fashion for 20 years, really goes back to brand purchasing practices. So I think that explains why there really is this shift in thinking among labor and human rights advocates towards addressing the top of the supply chain. So really looking at brand practices, purchasing practices, novel legal approaches, and of course, laws like SB 62.
Great, thank you, Lisbeth. Nivedita, what I find fascinating is that as this fight was unfolding in California during the pandemic, Asia Flow Wage Alliance's focus on wage theft had really sharpened across Asia as well. And so I'd love your perspective now on when you think of joint liability on brands, why is this a leading strategy for you all in holding brands accountable? And how is this being received in Asia, in the communities that you serve?
Thanks, Aisha. Since its inception, actually, AFWA has been working on the question of adequate and protected wages in garment supply chains. We've been advocating for a needs-based living wage, and we formulated the first ever cross-border living wage for garment supply chains in Asia. What we've been seeing is that not only are living wages not accessible to garment workers, but they're also routinely facing wage theft at existing poverty level minimum wage rates in Asia. We realize that wage theft is actually an inherent feature of garment supply chains. It's actually the central mechanism through which brands are passing on the costs of product market fluctuations to the most vulnerable workers in Asia, so that they're able to protect their businesses from risks and actually earn excess profits in the process. The pandemic kind of only aggravated this situation. We have data that shows that even before the pandemic, workers in their households were unable to meet basic consumption requirements. They were already severely indebted. They had no savings, no asset creation, no upward mobility after years in the garment industry. And so they had no resilience for further loss of wages during the pandemic. So AFWA and partner trade unions in Asia have really been arguing that any loss in wages in such a situation amounts to wage theft. We've been highlighting that this consistent wage theft is actually a result of governance gaps in supply chains, where brands evade liability for their actions which cause harm to workers. So we've been working on this new legal strategy where we're arguing that brands are joint employers of workers along with their suppliers, and therefore they're jointly liable for labor violations under national labor law, and in this case, wage theft facing workers. So we're using laws within Asian countries, existing laws, and filing legal complaints with national jurisdictions to hold brands legally liable and compensate workers for wage theft. We've filed complaints across South and Southeast Asia, and in many countries, we're actually in the process now of making the argument, in labor departments, in labor courts, that there is an employment relationship between brands and workers in their supply chains. Through this strategy, what we're really trying to do is articulate a legal paradigm within supply chains, which have so far relied on self-regulation by brands, on voluntary codes of conduct. The strategy is really a production country-led, Asian trade union-led complement to existing efforts to regulate supply chains, especially in the home countries of brands through due diligence mechanisms and related legislations. Regarding how the strategy is being received in these countries, it's really a question of being able to extend the existing laws in the context of transnational supply chains and transnational employment relationships. And because labor laws were formed in a period prior to these dense networks of like supply chains and the kind of globalization we see today, there is the task of actually extending existing labor laws and applying them to these new realities. And that's what really the labor movement in Asia is trying to do now.
Wonderful. Thank you, Nivedita. And so, the parallels here, I think, are not lost on us, right? This idea of, for the first time, telling brands and retailers, you are joint employers of workers and hence liable for wage theft. Elizabeth, I wonder if I can turn to you to paint a little bit of a picture of the type of opposition Senate Bill 62 faced, and, especially as we start to take this fight globally. What are some lessons learned in terms of the opposition and the old guard wanting to keep the status quo? What is some of the pushback that we faced?
Sure. So, and I know we're going to get into this, but SB 62 had incredible support, but it did have opposition specifically from trade groups that represented big business. And so I'm just going to go through some of the takeaways from the opposition. So one of the groups opposed to SB 62 was the California Chamber of Commerce, and their board is made up of Fortune 500 companies, banks, airlines, and they actually put SB 62 on their infamous job killer list. And usually at that point, if a bill is on that list, it has a 92% success rate of just dying. These bills very rarely pass. And it really is because of the lobbying dollars that these big companies put into killing bills. And when you look at the board of the California Chamber of Commerce, there's only really one retailer that's producing clothing, and that's Disney. Disney is a major licensor of apparel. They obviously use very complex supply chains to produce their apparel. And we have reason to believe that they were one of the main companies that was lobbying against the bill. The California Retailers Association, another big, powerful big business trade group, opposed SB 62. Its executive committee includes Kohl's, Amazon, Walmart, Macy's. And of course, Walmart and Kohl's were two companies that did not pay their suppliers for orders placed prior to the pandemic. So perhaps we should not be surprised that the notion of shared responsibility was anathema to them. We were more surprised, I think, by the vocal opposition of the American Apparel and Footwear Association, because they have a very broad membership that represents big and medium-sized companies. But once we started doing outreach to members of AFA, it became clear that a lot of the membership was not aware that the organization had taken an official position against the bill. And I think that's useful for organizing, because that means that sometimes opposition from trade groups is coming from the top, but it doesn't necessarily reflect the industry's take on a bill. And the other thing I wanted to point out about the opposition, what you might notice is that most of the companies I've named so far don't produce in the United States, or they don't produce substantially in the United States. So why do they care? Why did they care? And it really was because of this precedent of establishing liability on brands. And the American Apparel and Footwear Association was very honest and transparent that that was their problem with the bill early on. And it was only as the campaign started to succeed, our side started to succeed, that they shifted to this message of painting it as a job killer, painting it as a threat to American manufacturing. And we were very easily, well, I won't say easily, with a lot of effort, able to shift the message away from that narrative, because what we were asking of companies was very simple. It was to meet the minimum wage for garment workers. We were not increasing the costs on companies unless they were benefiting off of wage theft. And Aisha, I know you're going to talk more about this, but the other thing is that we really, I think, tapped into a new generation of business owners that see shared responsibility in this coming era of brand accountability as a good thing. It's going to level the playing field for responsible businesses and really help solve a lot of the inequality that we're seeing in the fashion industry.
Great, thank you, Elizabeth. And there is, a cluster of questions coming in on, what did we think was the secret ingredient, if you will, in passing Senate Bill 62? And as I look at the coalition, Marissa, I think there was a few key things, right? One is that this was worker-led legislation. And I think that's really important as we see policy pop up in different places globally and in the United States. Is the policy centering the voices of the people the policy professes to serve? Because often that is not the case. But with Senate Bill 62, this was really garment makers who were up against wage theft. They wanted not just piece rate eliminated, but the joint liability clause. This was really worker-led legislation. So I'd say that's one. Secondly, to Elizabeth's point, even though there was opposition, as the old guard, almost as knee-jerk reaction whenever there is any kind of labor protections to say this will be a job killer bill, that really sort of pushing back on that and bringing thoughtful industry, a different business coalition members to the table to say, for you, if you're doing what's right, this is essentially going to level the playing field. So there was thoughtful businesses that ended up endorsing the bill. I was also frankly astonished by the citizen grassroots power of this bill. And I know Remake, Fashion Revolution, but certainly GWC, a lot of solidarity, not just with labor, but with advocacy groups. It was the first time we were teaching young people to light up the phones of legislators, to send postcards to the governor, and really recognizing that there's almost a gap in education around people who want to care about ethical, sustainable fashion, don't quite know how to engage in the policy process. So there was a lot of hand-holding that went into that. So we built this broad coalition. The bill is now law. And so I turn it over to you, Marissa. One, with the question of what do you think was the single secret ingredient of getting this bill passed? And then the question of, well, what's next? How do you assure the successful implementation of this bill? Is there appetite to take this bill to other states?
Yeah, I mean, I think you named it. It was, it is our sort of, philosophy that anything we're doing, has to be worker-led, worker-centered. And so, first it was really organizing with workers so that they were ready to tell their story. They were ready, to tell it to the media, to give public testimony in legislative hearings, to talk to the electeds who would be, voting on their bill, and to talk to the community groups that would that could support them and build that public kind of momentum for this. And we formed a committee of workers very early on, and actually was a committee that was formed even before submitting the bill, and then we just sort of built around that committee, and that was where workers were trained. That's where workers made every single decision about the bill, whether they would accept an amendment, how they were going to tell their message in the media, who was going to do those, who was next up, who was ready for their first media interview, and a seasoned worker would sort of step aside and let a fellow member step up. They did all of that together. They met at least monthly, but often quite a lot more. That coupled with, as you said, focusing on what we really think is the new fashion industry in California, and especially in Los Angeles, this growing ethical, sustainable fashion businesses. We said we have to build with them. And this was out of our comfort zone. This was not our kind of 20-year history, but we said, we know we have to build with them because we have to tell the Chamber of Commerce, you got it wrong. We knew they had it wrong, but it doesn't resonate if it's coming from, the labor activists, right? We had to build with the businesses, and we built a network of 158 fashion businesses that signed and said, I endorse SB 62. That, with worker stories and those endorsements and taking that to our state legislature, was, I think it really upended what people thought was going to happen to this bill, which was die, as Elizabeth said. And I think it really threw the Chamber of Commerce. And then I would say that, there's a history in the United States of traditional labor unions and worker centers that are a little bit newer, much newer in the grand context, much smaller in the grand context, but very, very mighty. And but we knew that we had to partner with traditional labor. And so we partnered with our California Labor Federation, our Los Angeles Labor Federation, and various labor councils to say this is a united labor front that is pushing for this type of joint accountability. What does implementation look like? Again, starting with the workers, it's workers have to know about what this law is. All workers now, we're trying to reach all, the workforce. They have to know what their new rates are and how to defend them, because a bill is only as strong as its enforcement, right? A law is only as strong as its enforcement and the workers who are empowered to assert that right. We also have to let businesses know and brands know what their new obligations are, right? We also think it's important that we're letting contractors, the factory owners, know how brand liability changes the dynamic and how they can use SB 62 to ensure they're getting paid properly to comply with minimum wage and overtime laws. We also know that we have to continue to put good, constant, just to hold our labor agencies accountable, and make sure that they're doing their job and that they're implementing and enforcing this law. And we have seen that that is already happening, but we think it's really important that workers are informing that sort of their strategies, right? Because it was workers that brought this. So we're really focusing on that. We are seeing some good sort of implementation efforts out of the gate this year, which gives us hope, and we're making sure that we're in there to influence them. But I think we do have to remember that this is an industry with a very long culture of exploitation. And our members know this won't be a change overnight. But we conducted our first survey with at least our membership just this Saturday, because implementation also means tracking. We have to track what's happening out there so that we can make the right moves and bring the right strategies for good enforcement.
Great, thank you, Marissa. So to the person who asked the question on, what is the legal recourse now, the first number one piece is that in the bill, workers have to know what their rights are. So it's a lot of education, but you can actually take a wage claim theft to the labor commissioner and then get your back wages paid. But then there is sort of parallel outreach that's needing to happen with brands. Nivedita, I wanted to pivot to you in terms of, here we are now with, the California bill becoming law January 1st. How has this galvanized Asia Flow Wage Alliance's efforts that were already focused on wage theft? And then if I were to bundle in some of the other questions coming in on, where are some of the court cases when it comes to wage theft claims, and what's next for AFWA in that realm?
Yeah, the Garment Worker Protection Act actually provides a lot of strength to our efforts, to place joint employer liability on brands, because it demonstrates, that the highest level of brand accountability, that is legal liability in their supply chains, is not impossible or unfeasible as we've been told so far, but that it should be the standard. It's the first step in the right direction towards holding brands fully liable under labor law as joint employer for wage theft and all other labor violations. There's this general impression that there's a vacuum of laws within Asian countries to protect workers' rights. This is what we're really trying to challenge. It's not the lack of laws that causes wage theft and that precipitated, this pandemic crisis, but that brands evade liability under these existing laws. They do this by presenting themselves as, merely buyers of garments produced in Asia. Existing laws are not able to respond to these changes in production patterns through outsourcing of production down the supply chain. So the bill sort of provides supporting jurisprudence that can be presented in Asian courts to show that even within outsourcing arrangements and supply chains, brands can be held legally liable because they retain control over whether workers have jobs or not, how they perform their jobs, their working conditions, and whether and how much they'll be paid. They exert control through these outsourcing arrangements and use this control to increase their profits, and so shouldn't be allowed to evade liability for labor rights violations in their factories. And finally, we're trying to explore how the precedent set by the bill can be applied in the context of offshoring of production in global supply chains. And this is really the big question, where production is actually performed by suppliers in Asia, but design, retail, marketing, ownership, and control over profits is retained by brands in the global north. And this is really the argument that we are making to courts in Asia. They're asking national jurisdictions to respond to this reality and to this question of law. And we hope to set precedents through our litigation efforts to strengthen and apply existing laws in the context of both outsourcing and offshoring of production into Asia. Just to answer where the cases are at, it's a different process in different countries based on the legal system and available law. The cases are quite advanced in India because India already has a law for principal employer liability. And we are able to argue that brands are actually principal employers of workers. And we've been making this argument in labor departments and trying to really look at the manufacturing contracts between brands and their suppliers, examine them, and ask the question whether this contract actually proves that there is an employment relationship between brands and workers in terms of the control and supervision that brands exert over the working conditions in the terms of employment of workers in their supplier factories. In Sri Lanka as well, we've filed cases with the Labor Department, and the cases have been accepted, which is an implicit kind of, there's an implicit kind of understanding that then brands are seen as stakeholders, in the conciliation and in the investigation of these complaints. In other countries like Pakistan, we are actually looking at constitutional law rather than labor law. And we are trying to make these claims using certain constitutional protections available to workers. And that's where we'll have to push the law and try to extend it a little bit more using high courts and Supreme Courts in the country. So we have different processes going on in different countries. When we understand that the struggle will be long and it will be a long process of litigation, but we're excited about presenting these arguments and making these claims, which probably have never been heard before, within these national jurisdictions.
Wonderful. Thank you, Nivedita. I think there was for the cluster of questions on can we take SB 62 and apply it in other contexts? What I'm hearing from you is we have to look at the national constitutions. Probably the cases in Sri Lanka and India are the most far evolved, but there are strategy conversations happening around establishing that contractual relationship. Elizabeth, I wanted to turn to you to give us a sense from a policy landscape of what does this joint liability conversation and efforts that are happening in Asia and California mean for the fashion industry, but also policy writ large, right? We have lots of conversations still in the reporting and disclosure realm, but here we have out the gate workers saying what we need is not just reporting, but essentially liability and remedy. So can you speak a little bit more to the implications of the passage of this bill in the global policy landscape?
Yeah, and I would love to hear what my fellow panelists think about this as well. I mean, in some ways, SB 62 is a reflection of an already occurring shift in policy. So we see, with human rights due diligence laws that have passed in the EU, there's this shift towards requiring companies, first of all, acknowledging that human rights abuses often are instigated by businesses themselves, and that certainly they have an obligation to ensure that human rights abuses are avoided, mitigated, dealt with, and that remedy is provided to victims of human rights abuses. I think that, with SB 62, it's kind of a big vote of confidence in terms of strengthening human rights due diligence approaches. So ensuring that workers have recourse, that if a human rights violation is found, that workers are able to get paid back. I also think that, and Nivedita pointed this out earlier, and Aisha, I think you mentioned it earlier as well, is like bringing up this question of wage theft as a human rights violation. If we're going to be creating these human rights due diligence bills, I think that they need to be explicit that that includes reference to wages, living wages. Because right now what we're seeing is a lot of laws that are really focused on egregious violations of human rights, which is of course very important: forced labor, child labor. But the conversation needs to expand to including conversations about wages and social protections. I also think that Nivedita really hit on something, which is the challenge of fixing these issues across international supply chains. I think that's the challenge. Like, yes, we are all really interested in what SB 62 is going to look like at a federal level, but we're really going to have to get creative in terms of how do you hold brands accountable across supply chains for wages. And then the one other, there are a couple other things that I just want to mention that are going on that are connected to this, which is this broader conversation about addressing purchasing practices. So the prices that brands are paying to factories and the contracts that they impose on their suppliers. And we're seeing different civil society groups come up with different solutions, and all of them I think are really useful and exciting. So in the UK, there are some civil society groups proposing to establish a purchasing practice watchdog for the apparel industry. And then we also in the States have a working group of the American Bar Association that have developed these model contract clauses in a buyer code of conduct that would really commit brands to supporting prices that support living wages. And once these contract clauses are embedded in contracts, they're legally enforceable. So there's lots of things that are shifting, and that's just a bit of an overview.
Great, thank you, Elizabeth. Marissa, I wanted to turn to you to share what's next in terms of, now that this is law for Garment Worker Centers members, how has the passage of this bill informed GWC's strategic priorities going forward? And as you look to 2022, what's next for you?
Yeah, thank you. Yes, this year is really about a very broad outreach and education campaign. We're really making, our emphasis is getting out there literally into our fashion district on a regular basis and making sure that workers get the information they need to know about their new rights and how to defend them. And working as closely as we can with our State Labor Commission to ensure good implementation. And also really continuing to listen and learn and work with our ethical fashion business allies to learn how they can use SB 62 and to learn how to talk to business, to continue to find these strategies that will work to influence brand purchasing practices, because that is absolutely key. We've got to make sure that cash flow is happening in the supply chain to enable factories to comply with these new laws. It also, one of our major strategic decisions was when we pass SB 62, that we were also going to shift to include within our strategies these efforts to make sure that we're incentivizing compliance with labor standards. We're an organization that has often operated sort of using the kind of hammer or the kind of, watchdog, public, kind of campaigning. But we've also learned that you've got to have a carrot as well. And in talking with our business allies, we've been really listening to what are the obstacles to complying in an industry that is so steeped in labor exploitation. What does it take to stay afloat and do the right thing, to stay in business and do the right thing when the person down the street is severely underpaying their workers? And what we have determined is one thing that we really need to focus on in this year is pushing for more investment and attention from our local government in this industry, making sure that they're preserving the garment industry, making sure that they're investing in it as one of the major manufacturing sectors in this state and in this city, and they're investing in it as such. And that means making sure that the buildings are safe, making sure that there is the actual zoning that allows garment manufacturing to stay in place and not be displaced, but by gentrification and development in our downtown area. And it also means providing incentives to businesses that want and create ethical production models, giving them startup grants, giving them, training and development grants. And we want to work with businesses to develop these models and propose these types of policy and also private program changes.
So really important, right, Marissa, to talk about we need the carrots and the sticks. So we need workforce investment, revitalization, so that you can't just say, oh, the laws got stronger, so the industry fled California. Well, we have to have incentives in place for that to happen. Nivedita, there are a host of questions on sort of AFWA's strategic priorities. I know there's so much been going on in the pandemic, but this question of outside of the court cases, is there any work being done to look at the passage of policies like SB 62, in particular Asian nations? Is there any conversation around expanding this concept of joint liability, not just to apply for wage theft, but for other egregious violations like union busting or gender discrimination? Just wondering, sort of, knowing there's so much going on, what are some of the big things in your pipeline?
Yeah, I think once we're able to identify brands as joint employers of workers in their supply chains, we can actually extend this concept beyond wage theft. We're just using wage theft during the pandemic as a hook because there's been such widespread wage violations during the pandemic. But we can really demonstrate how the actions of brands translate into gender rights abuses or attacks on the right to freedom of association of workers. For instance, it's brands' threat of relocation that's always used by suppliers to prevent workers from organizing or engaging in collective bargaining in supplier factories. We know that it is production targets set by suppliers to respond to brands' demands and the kind of economic violence that's unleashed on women workers in the form of wage cuts, unpaid overtime, and other measures that lead to gender-based violence and harassment in garment factories. Suppliers rely on informalization of work. If you look at countries like Pakistan and Bangladesh, you'll see that all factories, even tier 1 formal factories, are full of casual workers, and it's a circulating workforce where workers don't stay in the factory for more than 2 or 3 months. And suppliers rely on this informalization because they can hire and fire based on flexible orders from brands. So all of these are connected to how brand actions determine working conditions in their supplier factories. And once we're able to make this connection, we will be able to say that brands are legally liable for human rights abuses in their supplier factories. So that's really the angle that we are trying to push, to identify brands as joint employers of workers using national laws. And to extend this concept, then, use this legal precedent in our courts to extend it to other forms of labor rights violations. In a lot of countries, this will mean having to extend existing labor laws. And to do this, we will have to really use constitutional protections in an attempt to convert that into labor protections. And this will then really become a question in high courts and Supreme Courts, where we try to apply constitutional law to labor rights abuses. So in that sense, it's also like a policy reform alongside litigation.
Wonderful. Thank you, Nivedita. Elizabeth, there is some questions coming in on the New York Fashion Act. For those of you just joining us, this year was an important year for policy, with Senate Bill 62 becoming the law, with some of these cases Nivedita has alluded to moving up in India and in Sri Lanka. And then, of course, you had the state of New York bringing the New York Fashion Act into the public domain. So the questions here, Elizabeth, are sort of focused on when it comes to due diligence, how does the New York Fashion Act stack up? And if you had a perspective on what are some of the ways that different states in the United States are going to be thinking about policy when it comes to the fashion industry.
I'm not sure if I have an answer to the second part of the question, but I can answer the due diligence approach in the New York Fashion Act. So in the first draft of the bill, the New York Fashion Act, it was advertised as a mandatory human rights due diligence bill, but it's a reporting bill. So it asked companies to map their supply chain, to reveal if they have any due diligence policies. So of course they could just say we have none and be in compliance. And then it asked companies to set targets on climate change, but there were no benchmarks in it for labor and human rights. So our coalition's reading on it is the first draft of it was very weak, especially on the human and labor rights side of things. And we put together a list of proposed amendments, which we can drop into the chat, that really focus on strengthening the language so that at the bare minimum that, you know, if the bill wants to pursue a human rights due diligence approach, that companies have to actually conduct due diligence, not just simply report on whether or not they have a due diligence policy. And the other thing that is really important to our group is, again, going back to this question of liability and remediation. It's ultimately workers and communities in the supply chain that are being impacted by these negative business decisions. So the Fashion Act really needs to supply remedy to people that are harmed by fashion. And the first draft of it did not include those elements. So our concern is that if the bill does not evolve, it might, you know, lead to copycat legislation in other states and would, quite frankly, put the US behind where Europe is at in terms of legislating brand accountability, and behind California. And if you'll remember at the top of the conversation, Marissa talked about loopholes and weak language and what happens when laws pass that are not crystal clear in terms of what is required of brands. That is, you know, why we're putting effort into seeing if this bill can move to something that can truly protect workers. But I just want to underscore what's at stake if it does not move. Garment workers in Los Angeles alone suffered millions of dollars in wage theft every year because of what seemed like a very small loophole in the law that ended up having a very dangerous impact on their everyday lives.
Thank you, Elizabeth. And Marissa, there's a question here. You had started to get into it in the talking about incentives and the need for carrots as well as the stick approach, right? So the question is, one of our biggest worries in the garment manufacturing industry is that you'll continue to see flight to Mexico, flight to other cities, perhaps states where you don't have as strong a legislation as California. So can you talk about engaging advocates or activists in Mexico or border cities, or sort of what's your strategy to engage with other worker-led coalitions in order to assure that that laws there are strengthened as well?
Yeah, I definitely think that, you know, I don't think that you can do this type of work and organize in this industry, especially I think in the US, without always being concerned about flight. This is an industry that has the world at its fingertips for chasing, you know, low wages, wherever, you know, going where it thinks it can go to do that. You know, I think a lot of, at this moment, I think a lot of our efforts is focused on, you know, especially in this year, just really, you know, implementation and getting the our local governments to really focus on this industry and put their efforts and their money, their investment in revitalizing and protecting this industry. But I think that the question is extremely important about how do we talk to workers around the world? How do we talk to our closest neighbors, and garment workers, and think, and really, I think it's going to be about mapping, if there is flight, where it's going, what are those brands that are taking their production somewhere, how long do they stay there? Excuse me, sometimes we've seen flight to even just neighboring states and then return, because the infrastructure is in Los Angeles for production in this area. It really is the hub and the center, because we have our port and we have a very condensed garment district. So I think the efforts are going to have to include mapping any sort of movement, and really, also going back to our bread and butter strategies of, like, if we need to publicly expose brands that are evading laws by taking their production elsewhere, we're also going to have to expose that, because there is a shift happening, and consumers care about where and how, particularly how their clothing is being made. And we know that because consumers take a stand, we know that they're going to care. They took a stand on SB 62, so they're going to care if their favorite fashion brands are trying to evade responsibility under SB 62. So I think a lot of the work, at least at the outset, is going to be tracking, monitoring, and talking to workers. I'm very interested in what sort of transnational organizing can happen, so that workers on any side of the border can say, no, you're not going to come over here and exploit me too. How can we support workers, for example, in Mexico, to do that? So I think those are next steps to explore.
Absolutely. And amen to transnational organizing, right? Certainly, we saw a lot of this happening in the pandemic. At the start of the pandemic, we were, 30, 40 organizations. It started to grow, where we were meeting on a monthly basis, sharing who's canceling orders, what's happening in the pandemic. And I've just been astonished by the kind of solidarity. And I'm hoping, much like panels like this, that we realize we're stronger together, and there is that solidarity across organizing. Nivedita, there's a question here around, you've got supply chain regulation in the pipeline. Is there any efforts or work when it comes to bilateral agreements or free trade agreements, and thinking about assuring that there are labor provisions and protections in those as well?
There's actually a lot of work within Asia on looking at labor protections within free trade agreements and bilateral trade agreements, but there's very little, I think, alignment between those working on supply chain regulation and the work on corporate accountability and responding to labor violations using FTAs. We really need to have those conversations. I think they're really important, given that most of international trade today is happening via global supply chains, specifically in the garment industry, where several Asian countries are intensely reliant on garment exports, as a part of their development strategy. And this really throws up the broader question of whether garment supply chains are actually delivering on their promise of lifting workers out of poverty, of providing quality employment in in Asian countries, whether they're delivering on this promise, or whether they're actually pushing workers deeper into poverty. And I think there needs to be an alignment between those working on corporate accountability within international trade and those working on regulation of supply chains. And we need to understand international trade in terms of the fact that most of it is happening via global supply chains.
Great, thank you, Nivedita. Elizabeth, I'm going to try and cluster some of these questions. I'm so excited that everyone is so engaged in this discussion. There's a question here first around, a lot of the work we do at Remake around education. Like, how do you cut through the greenwashing claims when it comes to brands talking about upholding worker rights, investing in worker well-being, when certainly with a lot of our campaigning and advocacy efforts, we've seen the opposite. So how do you cut past the greenwashing? And then the second question is more around, as we think to the future of the industry, will we see more and more automation simply as a way to cut back on labor costs, since that seems to be one of the largest cost centers for industry?
I might kick that first question back to you, but I mean, I think in terms of cutting through the greenwashing, it's pretty simple because as we've reiterated throughout the conversation, the environmental and social impact of fashion largely happens in the supply chain, and currently brands are not responsible in most jurisdictions for what happens in their supply chain. So that's why there's so much frustration in the conscious consumer community, because you can really sense the doublespeak, brands saying they care when really there's a complete lack of accountability. And Aisha, if you want to, you can talk more about messaging. But in terms of automation, this is actually really an interesting question, because one of the big supporters and vocal advocates of SB 62 was Cytex, which is a denim mill that onshored, opened a location in California during the pandemic. And the owner talks very eloquently about how, automation and job creation can in fact coexist. And it's actually a really useful tool in high wage nations, relatively high wage nations like the United States. So he runs this incredibly modern, high-tech denim manufacturing facility in California. You could say that it's highly automated, but his factory was able to create hundreds of jobs in California in the middle of the pandemic, paying higher than minimum wage. So I think that that's the way I think about it, is seeing how automation can make the fashion industry more productive, potentially make better jobs for workers, and really solve some of these tensions in high wage nations like the US.
And I would just add, one of the things that Nivedita, Marissa, and Elizabeth have done such an eloquent job here is to say, look, it's about wages, stupid, right? So if we want to cut past all of the greenwash of brands, like the fundamental question here is, here we have a pandemic. Garment workers are not just making our clothes, they're making our protective gear, they're essential workers. Are they even making a basic minimum wage? And if you aren't able to have that conversation, if you're actively lobbying against ways for workers to be putting food on the table, then we don't care how many 90-page glossy reports you're publishing when it comes to the ways that you're protecting and upholding human rights, because that is greenwash. So I think the pandemic has in some ways cracked wide open a lot of these questions. And Elizabeth, to your point, it sounds like automation can certainly, and we have seen this in the state of California, go hand in hand with workers having high-skilled, better-paying jobs. With 3 minutes to spare, I'm sorry, we're going to try and answer some of the questions on the chat. We'll also drop all of the organizations' URLs again, so you can follow the important work of AFWA and Garment Workers Center and Remake's work. But I wanted to give each of our panelists a minute to close out on what is keeping you hopeful. This has been, already a turbulent year for workers, but lots of inroads being made. So as we think about 2022, and Nivedita, I'll start with you. What are you most galvanized, excited about?
I'm really excited about building a really Asia-led Global South contribution to the sharpened focus on regulation of supply chains and brand accountability. Really want to be able to speak to spaces that have usually been global north dominated, and conversations that have been global north dominated, and build a capacity of trade unions, of lawyers, of enforcement and justice delivery institutions within Asia to contribute to these conversations. We're really hoping, to strengthen due diligence efforts and other efforts in brand home countries by complementing it with a ground-up strategy that centers workers, unions, and the government labor movement in Asia. And we really hope our work can be used to draw out learnings when designing and implementing these mechanisms and legislations, and can actually inform and influence business and human rights discussions that are located in the global north. So yeah, I'm really excited, for making space for trade unions and for actors in the global south to, take over these discussions that they've usually been kept out of.
Amazing. More solidarity to come then, Nivedita. Marissa?
I'd say what gives me hope is, it's when workers are coming together. We just had our general membership meeting this Saturday, and when our membership is coming together to talk about SB 62 implementation, to talk about how to, preserve and revitalize their industry, but based on their demands and their needs. It just kind of remotivates you, reinvigorates you. Our members also recently gathered in a virtual worker exchange with agricultural workers in Florida to learn what models and strategies they're using to hold brands accountable in the agriculture industry, and learning from that, and getting the juices flowing about what strategies they can bring here. That's hopeful. That's workers coming together and finding their, identifying their needs, their demands, and their solutions. And then the other thing that really gives me hope is spaces like this, when women are coming together from these worker-centered organizing strategies and sharing them, and just these really phenomenally just intellectual and brilliant and exciting models. That gives me hope. It really gets my brain excited. And I just love sort of that's what organizing in this industry is. It's just this real synergy between being very rooted in workers' demands and also creating these amazing, groundbreaking strategies, because we have to we have to do it, right? But that's exciting as well. Yeah.
Absolutely. And, I would close this out by saying I'm just so excited that policy is finally on the agenda. We've had some 30 years of the industry saying our codes of conduct, our corporate responsibility, we're going to grow and address these issues. And here we are really seeing the type of organizing to put smart policy like Senate Bill 62, finally establishing joint liability with all the work that's happening in Asia as well. So stay tuned, folks. Lots more happening in this space. Please join me in thanking our wonderful panelists, and hopefully you can keep up with all the important work. Many of you are asking about the recording. We'll be sure to send it to all registered participants, and look forward to the continued solidarity across all our organizations. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.